All right, so welcome to the August 21st edition of the Biomass webinar series. This is a series dedicated to providing a forum for us to share research and industry and other types of updates and to connect as a network of people who are developing or considering developing biomass for bioenergy and bioproducts. The series is brought to you by a few funders. The U.S. Department of Energy sponsors this through the Center for Advanced Bioenergy and Bioproducts Innovation, or CABI. The USDA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, sponsors the series through the Diverse Corn Belt Project. And then the series is sponsored also by iRegen, a regenerative ag initiative dedicated to regenerating health and wealth in the Midwest through regenerative ag. And that's brought to us by a series of private funders. The series is mainly supported by the University of Illinois through a cross-campus initiative from multiple different institutes on campus and Iowa State University. I will say that next week, Iowa State University will be the host of the webinar series. Dr. Nick Boersma will be facilitating the discussion when Evan Bernowski tells us about water quality programs developed for Miscanthus in particular. So today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Jeremy Martin from the Union of Concerned Scientists, who's going to tell us about biofuels policy as ag policy. Thank you, Jeremy.
Great. So I'll just dive in. This is the outline for my talk today. I'm going to start by looking a little bit at biofuels policy as transportation fuels policy, because that's, I think, the way that it's often presented and we think about it. So I want to look at the data from that perspective, and then sort of look at, how the big corn ethanol boom affected agriculture, more recent expansions we've seen in biodiesel and renewable diesel, and then really dig into, how could biofuels support sustainable agriculture. And I'll make the argument that to do that effectively, we need to look a little bit beyond just transportation fuel carbon intensity as a metric. And I'll conclude with some thoughts on what this means for biomass. I've got a few extra details for the discussion, but trying to keep this on time and not too deep in the weeds at any one point. So let's jump in. So first, as transportation energy, this is the data that I look at, kind of looking over the last almost 50 years. And until about 2000, there was effectively only petroleum powering the transportation sector. But over the last 25 years, we've seen the growth first of ethanol, then of biodiesel, and most recently of renewable diesel. And today, we've got about 7% of transportation energy coming from biofuels. So, that's the biggest change we've seen in transportation energy since the coal-fired steam locomotives left the scene. But it's still a relatively small share. And in a way, what's interesting is that, if you look at this, you see almost no electricity. It barely registers even a pixel at this scale. And yet, when people think about the future of transportation energy, and especially of decarbonizing transportation, electricity looms very large. This is a chart from a study that we did at Union of Concerned Scientists, looking at what it would take to meet the U.S. climate goals, getting to net zero by 2050. And of course, the centerpiece of that strategy, really across the economy, is you've heard the phrase probably electrify everything, and then repower it all with renewable energy. And in transportation, of course, that means replacing the cars and trucks with electric vehicles, powering them with renewable energy. If we do that, we could cut liquid fuel consumption by as much as 85%. That's what's shown here, is sort of 85% reduction. To kind of put a range around it, we're pretty ambitious in a lot of different areas there. So let's call it 70 to 85%, just to kind of get a sense of, what the scale is. Now, obviously, this study was done a couple of years ago. This was what we think should happen and could happen, not what we think is happening. And certainly with this administration, the timeline that's depicted there, and certainly the question of whether, well, the timeline is clearly uncertain. And the other thing that's really uncertain is whether the US is going to be a leader in this field or a laggard. But I think it is pretty clear at this point that this is the direction technological change is headed, even if we're not quite sure about the schedule. But so the point I want to make here is just that after we've electrified the cars and trucks, what we still clearly need is liquid fuel for jets and for some other applications as well. And it just in terms of scale, I put up here the kind of current biofuel consumption to kind of get a sense of the scale. So our current biofuel consumption is roughly half of what, even in the most ambitious projection we'd need in when we've electrified transportation, and potentially just a quarter. Sort of, we need 2 to 4 times as much as we've got now from a kind of transportation fuel demand perspective if we want to fully phase out petroleum. So existing fuels provide 1.5 to 2 quads. We need 4 to 8. What else is there? Of course, biomass is the obvious uh, opportunity there. And just to put some rough numbers on there, I think there's the potential to make at least a quad. So I hope these units aren't too confusing, but just to ground it there, right? So we're looking for 4 to 8 quads. We've got 1 to 2. We could get another quad from residues, 3 to 5 quads from energy crops. So that looks like it's basically enough to close the gap. If we do all that and keep all the biofuels we've got. The other thing people talk about a lot these days in the environmental space is electrofuels. So by that they mean using renewable electricity to generate hydrogen or water, using that hydrogen plus CO2 captured from somewhere or another to synthesize hydrocarbon fuels. And doing that, in theory, you can make almost any amount of fuel. There's not a sort of physical limit in the same way, but it takes a lot of extra renewable power. And of course, we need a lot of renewable power right now to electrify everything else and to replace all the fossil power. So, that's sort of a theoretical possibility in down the road. But for both of these, whether you're thinking about biomass-based fuels or electrofuels, there's substantial investment required in feedstock. Whether those feedstocks are collecting residues, growing energy crops, or building out renewable electricity, we don't have what we need there, and we're going to need a lot of progress in the conversion technology, scale up, cost reduction, and all of that has uncertain economic competitiveness with incumbent feedstocks and technologies, and depends a lot on policy. So that's sort of, like just summarize thinking about biofuels as transportation fuel. They can complement or replace petroleum in applications where electrification is expensive or impractical. The scale of US liquid fuel consumption is currently about 14 times US biofuel consumption. And if we electrify most of the cars and trucks, then we'd be looking at something like 2 to 4 times current biofuel consumption, which we could meet with either biomass-based fuels or e-fuels. So at a very high level, I think that's the perspective from transportation is, we need liquid fuels. It'd be great to get them from biofuels. Hopefully they won't be too expensive, and hopefully you could make a lot of it. But I think that really, doesn't adequately capture where biofuels have the biggest impact. And so that's why I want to kind of look instead at biofuels from an agricultural perspective. And start with the corn ethanol boom. This is not news, so I'll go over this pretty quickly, but I think it's important grounding. And so, of course, the corn ethanol boom between 2000 and 2010 increased the acres of corn in the United States by more than 10 million acres. I charted here kind of how many acres of corn are harvested in the US and allocated that to the different uses. And you could see basically all the growth in corn over the last couple decades has come from ethanol. And that increased demand for corn, of course, because it expanded acres, it didn't just affect corn, it affected other commodity crops that compete with corn for land. And so, I think in a way, though, the impact on agriculture was more profound than is reflected by this chart, which goes up by 10 million acres. I mean, 10 million acres is a lot, but I guess my observation and what I've heard from talking to people is I think it really changed the way a lot of people in agriculture think about this. How do you make sure that what do you do with the U.S. agricultural surplus? What do you do when crop prices are low? And Jonathan Coppice made a remark in his book, The Fault Lines of Foreign Policy, that arguably the RFS is the most successful farm policy to date, even though it's technically energy and environmental policy. It's driven crop prices for all commodities to record highs, surpassing historical impacts from exports and war. And I've heard from other people that, post RFS, instead of clamoring for access to export markets and other things, really the focus has been, hey, why not just expand demand for biofuels? That's can always be the answer. And from what we saw before, right, demand for transportation fuels is so much larger than agricultural production. That seems like a strategy with no real endpoint. But of course, there are costs to this as well. Increased corn cultivation really set back a lot of agricultural conservation outcomes, increasing land conversion, increasing nutrient pollution, decreasing land and conservation programs. And so, there are important costs and benefits that people have spent a lot of time explaining in great detail. But this is, of course, an old story. A lot of this happened more than 15 years ago. And so what's happening now? Right. And the big change in the last decade or so has been the vegetable oils-based fuels, bio-based diesel. This is a chart showing how much oils and fats were used to produce. So the orange line here shows how much oils and fats were used to produce the fuels that were consumed in the United States. And then the bars show all the oils and fats produced in the United States. And the point that's really striking is that, since 2011, when bio-based diesel really started growing quickly, the consumption has grown much faster than domestic production of fats and oils. Production's been increasing or consumption's been increasing about 3 times faster than production. The largest source of vegetable oil in the United States is soybean oil. And if we just think about, how much is yield growth provide for additional soybean oil, if you look at the trend yield growth on 87 million acres, which is about how much soybeans we've been growing, that gets you about an extra 0.22 metric tons of vegetable oil each year. And that's if all of the additional yield goes towards crushed for oil. And so the growth rates that we've been seeing, 1.5 million metric tons, are just so much larger than increased production. So that's, a big contrast with corn. And of course, the logical consequence of that is if consumption's outpacing production, then we've got to be changing imports. And that's exactly what's been happening. If you look at the US bio-based diesel consumption is increasingly coming from either imported feedstocks or fuels. In 2024, it was 43%. And particularly if you look at the growth over the last few years, 70% of the growth between 2022 and 2024 came from imported feedstocks or fuels. And as a consequence, the US has become a major global importer of fats and oils, and is now the 4th largest importer of vegetable oil in the world, behind India, China, and the European Union. So, as a country with normally we think of as having a big agricultural surplus, it's a little bit startling to see how much we're importing. And, there's a big effort now to address this, with various kinds of incentives and prohibitions. But the reality is we just don't make enough vegetable oil to support the level of bio-based diesel that we're consuming. So just to kind of wrap up some of the contrasts, I think, between the corn part of this story and the biofuel and the bio-based diesel part of the story. I think corn has been largely a domestic story, where bio-based diesel is a much more kind of global story. On the one hand, ethanol has established itself as a cost-effective part of gasoline, providing the sort of high-octane part of the blend. By contrast, vegetable oil-based fuels are very expensive, and they're totally uneconomic without continued subsidies, direct or indirect, worth $2 a gallon, $2 a gallon or more. The other big contrast that I've just mentioned is that, ethanol demand basically played out with US increased corn production, where in the bio-based diesel side, the consumption has really outpaced the domestic supply. So growth has come from imports or from diversion from other markets. And where ethanol really did, increase prices in acres for corn and other crops in the US, bio-based diesel is a more complicated story. And because soybean oil is just part actually a small part of the soybeans, when you increase demand for oil, it tends to push down, or when you increase prices for oil, it tends to push down prices for meal, so that the total price impact on whole beans is actually much less than the impact on soybean oil. So that sort of mutes how much the demand for soybean oil plays out in the soybean markets. And then the second piece is that you can't really sell more soybeans than there is a market for meal. And so if you just keep expanding demand for oil way beyond the demand for meal, then globally, that's basically got to benefit the palm oil producers because they're the ones who produce oil without meal. And so when you really are imbalancing the market this way, this is where a lot of the benefits are going to go. So I think there's some pretty big differences. And then the last difference is in terms of the environmental impacts. Uh, the impacts of growing more corn are really visible in the Midwest, right? Increased nutrient pollution, increased land conversion, increased acres of corn, reduced acres in conservation program. Uh, on the vegetable oil side, because a lot of what's happening is we're not growing more, we're just shifting the use and diverting vegetable oil from diverting soybean oil and other fats from food to fuel, then the replacements are actually showing up in distant places, especially in the tropics, where more palm oil is being grown to replace the diverted soybean oil. And so, very different stories that play out differently, both in terms of the benefits and the impacts. So, looking, backwards from where we are, biofuels have been primarily kind of contributing to the increased share of U.S. acres in corn and soybeans. This is sort of the big picture, right? This is definitely not to say this chart here reflects only biofuels, but biofuels are a significant part of the story of more and more acres of corn and soybeans versus everything else. And really this change of shifting U.S. agricultural output away from global markets for food and feed and towards U.S. fuel consumption. And in the case of recently, really making the U.S. not just shifting our own production, but becoming a major importer of vegetable. So that's where we are. But where do we go from here? Right? Can we have biofuels that support sustainable agriculture, and what would that require? So first, what do I mean by that? And so very broadly, some of the goals I have in mind is, can we create value from underutilized land and resources? Can we build healthy soils, improve water quality, habitat, biodiversity? Can we diversify agriculture, protect sensitive ecosystems, and protect food security? So, that's what we'd like to see. And the argument I'm going to make is that we're going to have to think about how we structure biofuel. And so right now, biofuel policies focus very much on carbon intensity. That's sort of, since the question people are asking is this a good transportation fuel? How does this fuel compare to gasoline or diesel or petroleum-based jet fuel? And to do that, we use this carbon intensity calculation, especially since 2007, when the RFS2 was passed. So life cycle analysis is sort of a core strategy for figuring this out. In the renewable fuel standard, the eligibility for the program, for the mandates, is based partly on carbon intensity. And then in the state low carbon fuel standards, carbon intensity is basically the whole basis on which fuels are evaluated. And likewise, the newish federal 45Z clean fuel production tax credit based on carbon intensity. And so when you have a policy framework based on carbon intensity, then any policy preferences have to basically be factored into the carbon intensity score. And then the outcomes are left to the fuel markets to decide. But I'll argue this works better in theory than in practice. But to cover the theory, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time because Madhu Khanna at the University of Illinois and co-authors just did a great job kind of explaining the theory about how you can accomplish all of these different things. You could think about supporting soil carbon sequestration and reduced emissions from farming and feedstock production. You could think about the conversion process and reducing emissions there, or capturing carbon there. And you could even try to factor in consequences of carbon permanence or indirect land use change emissions related to biofuel expansion. And each of these things is sort of factored into the calculation of one number, the carbon intensity of the fuel. And then policies like low carbon fuel standards or tax credits can basically encourage people to lower that number and hopefully move all of these different things in a positive direction. So that's the theory, but let me explain a few reasons I think that that theory struggles a little in practice. Uh, so this is some thoughts summarizing things in this, or at least my take on some things in this National Academy study that I participated in a few years ago. And the first point to make is just that carbon intensities are actually not a well-defined physically measurable thing. So there isn't just like a clear number that everybody agrees on for the carbon intensity of any given fuel. The model structure, boundary conditions, inputs, and assumption can actually lead to very, very different results depending on how you do this analysis. And in particular, there are kind of two big categories of life cycle analysis that have very different purposes. One category is what's called attributional analysis. And the example, the best known example is probably the GREET tool developed by Argonne National Laboratory. And this really looks at it from the perspective of a biofuel producer and says, what were all the inputs to that process, and add up all those inputs, what's the pollution associated with those inputs, try to influence the incentives that the biofuel producer has. If you use lower carbon inputs, you'll get a lower carbon fuel, and you'll benefit from a carbon intensity framework. And so that's the one kind of life cycle analysis. But then the other kind of life cycle analysis is what's called consequential analysis. And that's really what's required to understand, like, what happens if the US uses so much vegetable oil-based fuel that it's sort of more than all the vegetable oil produced in the US. Where does that vegetable oil come from? What's the consequence? What does it happens in food markets, in land use change across the globe? And it's a very different question, and different kinds of methods are used to answer it. And when you just add those two things up, you're not really answering any well-defined question anymore. It's really, so that's a kind of technical or theoretical objection. But besides that, there are real political challenges with this approach. And the first one is that, when the carbon intensity scores don't support the preferred outcomes, then the methodologies are very subject to manipulation. Because there's so many kind of choices in how you do this analysis, you can sort of get whatever answer you want. The other thing that I think is a real downside from a public policy perspective is that the models are so complex, and they actually have multiple models, that almost nobody is an expert in all of the models, and it makes it incredibly opaque and constrains kind of meaningful public input and participation in this process. And finally, perhaps most fundamentally, I think policymakers are often trying to achieve goals that are not actually just how do I lower the carbon intensity of a transportation fuel, but they actually care about the quantities of different feedstocks that are used and things like that. And so, they're trying to influence something with a very kind of convoluted and indirect tool, and I'll give a few examples. So recently we've had a lot of debate about, how do we ensure that there's a robust market for US soybean oil in the face of competition from imported used cooking oil? So that's clearly a policy objective. Another one is, how do we ensure that corn has a role in jet fuel markets, compensate for falling demand for ethanol and gasoline blending? That's another. And then on the opposite side, in California, there's a lot of concern that maybe California is using so much vegetable oil-based fuel. They're concerned about that. So how can they limit the expansion of vegetable oil-based fuels within the California low carbon fuels? So all of these are kind of policy outcomes people are seeking to influence that have to do with like how much of a feedstock is used. And tweaking the carbon intensity model is a pretty indirect way to affect those outcomes. So, why not just give the policymakers what they want? Instead of manipulating carbon intensity calculations to achieve multiple policy objectives through this single lever, what if we used multiple mechanisms to support these policy goals? So my argument is if we separate incentives and safeguards that correspond to different primary policy goals, that would be more transparent and also make it easier for the people tasked with administering these policies to implement them. So I think these attributional, so I think, we could break this into kind of three pieces, and I'll go through these in a little more detail. For some parts, especially where you're trying to influence the behavior of biofuel producers, I think these attributional tools like GREET are a great tool. In other areas, where we're trying to influence, how much of a feedstock is used, really a feedstock quantity oriented safeguard would be a more direct way to align consumption with availability. And finally, when we're thinking about farm-based incentives for preferred crops and practices, I want to think about, what's the best way to actually support those kind of outcomes. So I'll say a little bit more about each of these things. The first, attributional carbon intensity scores to govern fuel production. I think we have a lot of experience with this now. I think it works quite well to influence the behavior of biofuel producers. It's also a very useful way to compare dissimilar fuels like gasoline, ethanol, and electricity under a broad policy like a low carbon fuel standard. And it also gives you flexibility if a new fuel comes in down the road that wasn't in view when the policy was designed. You have a framework that can adapt. So those are really good things about this approach, but it's a pretty indirect means of influencing market-wide phenomenon. And really, the way I think about it is this is a tool that really focuses on the biofuel producer. And if you're thinking about a market-wide thing that's outside of the control of the producer, then this is kind of a awkward tool. If you're thinking about, well, if we use so much soybean oil for fuel, then what are people in India going to eat more palm oil and less soybean oil or something? And of course, that's not under the control of a biofuel producer and the people who. So this isn't the best tool for that job. And then I'll also say that when we're thinking about the carbon intensity of transportation fuel, that's a few steps removed from farmers growing feedstocks. Uh, so the thing that I'm most excited about these days is thinking about how could we structure feedstock safeguards based on sustainable availability. So I'll say a little bit about that now, and I have another slide if you want to ask me in the Q&A. But so basically, right now when we do this indirect land use analysis, we do a big global analysis of market-mediated impacts on food prices, land use change, and I think that's important analysis. But instead of using it to tweak the carbon intensity score, I think it actually makes more sense to say, based on that kind of analysis, how much feedstock do we think is available? And so that looks like asking, how much corn, how much vegetable oil, how much used cooking oil, how much corn stover, perennial grass is available to make biofuels when we consider what are the competing uses and what are the consequences of using more or using less. And so that could look like a pretty simple formula. For example, we could say, well, we're using about 5 billion bushels of corn to make ethanol, and we really want to have some stability in this market. So, but yields increase, so we could adjust the bushels based on trend yield, and that would effectively keep the footprint corn used for biofuels at a fixed point. So that would be a kind of very simple formula which would address land use change through a feedstock safeguard. You could also certainly imagine a more complex determination based on multiple factors. These days I hear news about potentially a big corn crop and saying, wow, you better increase consumption of ethanol to address big corn crop. And I can see that argument, but I guess if you want to make that argument, you should also make the opposite argument. Like a few years ago when there was a huge global food crisis, really led by high vegetable oil prices, that would have been a good time to back off on using vegetable oil for fuel. And some countries did, but actually the U.S. just kept right on ramping up the use of vegetable oil for fuel right in the middle of a global food crisis and record high vegetable oil prices. So, I think you could think about different ways to make this determination depending on, what are the priorities. But the result would be, come up with a number or a schedule for how much feedstock's available. And then we really need a market-wide constraint to limit feedstock utilization at that level across all biofuel uses. And that's also, I think, an important point in where biofuel markets are headed now, right? When we started off in the RFS, you sort of mostly had ethanol and biodiesel. Now we had biodiesel and renewable diesel. We're competing for the same feedstocks, and now people are starting to talk about jet fuel. And the question of like how much corn or vegetable oil is available for jet fuel has a lot to do with how much corn and vegetable oil are being used for gasoline or diesel fuel. So we really, when we're thinking about what's available to make into biofuel, we need to think about that, across fuel categories and not sort of within an individual category. So as I've already said a couple times, I've got some more specific examples of how to implement such a thing, but For now, let me keep going and just say a few words about farm-based incentives. Uh, and so, obviously farmers play a key role in the sustainability of biofuels. And historically, their involvement in biofuels policy has been fairly limited. And there's some initial efforts underway now to quantify the carbon intensity benefits of climate smart practices and include those in the federal tax policy implementation. So, I think we'll learn over the next few years, how well that's working, how well it works for farmers, does it really change practices, et cetera. Uh, so, that's one way to do it. But I'll say, what some of the vital ecosystem services and especially water quality benefits, may not be well represented if we're just looking at the carbon intensity of the biofuel. Uh, and so I think there's other mechanisms, and again, I have a little more if you're interested in the Q&A to come back to, that could shift some of the control of this towards the farmers versus passing everything through biofuel producers, and also to support environmental outcomes that look beyond uh, transportation fuel carbon intensity. So to wrap up, what does this mean for biomass crops? Well, so the argument I've tried to make here is that biofuel policies have a more profound impact on agriculture than they do on transportation. And they really should be designed with agriculture in mind. We know that sustainable biomass feedstocks can build soil health, improve water quality, diversify agriculture, and create additional value from underutilized land. I'm not going to spend a lot of slides explaining that to you because that's what I've learned from the other webinars in this series and from my interactions with these folks over a long time. And so I think if we have safeguards that really point people towards safeguards based on sustainable availability, that will point people towards using underutilized crops. And I think certainly that's an opportunity for biomass crops. If we have incentives that really support agricultural conservation outcomes, that should also support biomass crops that advance these outcomes. And really, my final thought is that I don't think biofuel policies should be so technology neutral that they ignore the opportunities to improve the agricultural system. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. And I hope I've said it in a reasonable amount of time and look forward to discussion.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, and great pictures. I have one question that you might not want. Where does indirect land use change fit in the framework that you presented today?
Sure. I mean, well, I guess my argument is that indirect land use change is I mean, we don't, what do I want to say? Right now, the way we deal with indirect land use change is we try to add it to the life cycle of the biofuel. And then we hope that we will avoid harmful land use change because of the market signal that that sends. And, I think in the vegetable oil case, we could make two arguments, right? I mean, one is that clearly it's not working to avoid these harmful outcomes because the US is massively expanding its consumption of vegetable oil way beyond what it's producing, and that's increasing palm oil cultivation. And that doesn't make any sense in terms of avoiding indirect land usage. But we have this as part of the life cycle. So, either we're doing the life cycle analysis wrong and we're sending the wrong signal, or maybe that's just not the right way to think about the problem. And from my perspective, especially on the vegetable oil front, all of these feedstocks are linked. Even the used cooking oil, the tallow, all of these things, substitute for each other at some level. And the real question isn't, how much blame should we attribute to soybean oil or something? The real question is how much soybean oil is available before the costs outweigh the benefit. So I think the way to address land use change is to, kind of look at how much land use we want to devote to biofuels and figure out how much biofuel we can produce, in that land, and then, set a limit that's how much we'll use. So I'm still trying to address this concern about land use change, but just address it more directly by saying, that's really a question of the quantity of biofuels. It's not so much a characteristic of the biofuel production process.
Okay, so just a point of clarification there. I think I understand what you're saying, but recently the new requirements for CI scores are that you can exclude and direct
Right.
land use change from your calculation of carbon intensity for grain crops. And so I guess under your thesis here, that's just yet another trick that policymakers are trying to manipulate within the current framework to affect ag policy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some way, what's refreshing is it's not even a trick, right? So instead of digging into the model and in a really inscrutable way, trying to make sure that the number comes out the way you like it, they're just saying, yeah, get rid of it. I don't care. I don't care about land use change. I don't care about deforestation. Do whatever you want, right? So that's the message. Uh, but I some of the slides here were from my comments to EPA, and I tried to emphasize actually, if you're trying to build a domestic biofuels industry, you're messing up because we can't have a domestic biofuels industry that big when you're talking about oils and fats. That's just more than we've got, and you got to be realistic about how much we have if you want to have a industry that makes sense.
Great, thank you. And I see Travis has his hand up.
Yeah, hey Jeremy, great talk, and I appreciate the insights to the incentives and what might work best with farmers. My company's kind of going through the painstaking efforts right now of developing a CI score for biogas to transportation fuel
Mm-hmm.
um, through the use of miscanthus, and so we get into a lot of those conversations about land use change from row crops to perennial grasses and how big of an impact is that on your CI score. Um, and I've the little bit of that I know or been involved in this market is really the folks who run these models, don't have a good sense of perennials because perennials are so new. There's not a lot of data out there to support wide use land changes and production. So it's really difficult to show significant impacts in your CI score due to that. I like the thought of low carbon fuel markets relying on CI score, but I think that from my perspective, creating, if policy could create some standardization where the science community develop these CI scores and kind of set levels for certain crops and certain, I guess, through certain technologies to get to a biofuel.
Mm-hmm.
That would be obviously a lot easier of a process and a lot less costly for developers. And one could point towards the RFS as kind of an example of that, right? They set D3 RINs and versus D5 RINs, and they have different values based on the quality of the RIN produced. But my question to you is, I've noticed here in the most recent years, there used to be this high ceiling of compliance RINs that needed to be met on this D3 side, and those were never met in the past, and hence the government's now lowered those thresholds. And so, because they've lowered those thresholds, there's reluctancy in the markets to develop projects around D3s because there's no D3 RINs available. So, can you kind of comment to the RFS and those RINs? And is that a good way, I guess, to look at incentives related to crops? And do you feel like those
Mm-hmm.
may increase in the future?
Well, I mean, I think the RFS, hasn't been amended the law right since 2007, and so I think it doesn't correspond that well to the markets as we see them today. So I think it makes sense to update the RFS, and in a certain way, I think the RFS, when it was initiated, reflected a particular vision, especially right the corn and cellulosic numbers. People were thinking, well, people may not think it was a good idea, but the corn industry definitely said, we want to sell this much ethanol. We know how much corn that'll be. We think that'll be good for corn prices, and that's what they were looking for. So they had a clear view of what they were hoping to accomplish. Uh, I think we had a lot less clarity into the advanced and cellulosic categories, and things haven't played out, on the schedule that was laid out there. So, one of the things that I think could be done is to, look at this and say, what are where are we headed with these other feedstocks, and how much is available or that reflected our current understanding of where agriculture is and where it's headed. But so I don't know if I've exactly answered your question. I mean, I guess I appreciate that it's hard, especially for novel feedstocks, to get a new score. And I think insofar as we're adding everything into the score, and so we want to know everything about planting and soil carbon and all that stuff. And then we want to know everything about the land use change implications and how that plays out about the globe. And we want to know everything about your manufacturing process. That's a lot to do in one number. And I guess my argument in a way is I think there's actually 3 or 4 questions there. And if we separate the questions and say, okay, well, the biofuel producer needs to be able to answer these questions about their process. These are the things that are under their control, and this part of the policy addresses them. And then there's a different part of the policy, which is like, here's what we want to know from farmers. And, we'll use the best knowledge and that we have to understand what we're trying to accomplish that way and create incentives that move us in the right direction. And then in terms of land use change, that's where I think we have to say, do we think, and I guess some people take the attitude towards land use change that like anything that uses land gets an ILUC penalty. So perennial crops have to have an ILUC penalty just like corn does. And I think, or vegetable oil. And I think that's not what I think anymore. Because I don't think every piece of land is the same, right? I mean, I think if we have an idea that we want to move to a US agricultural system that's more diversified, that protects water quality, then we may say, well, actually, we'd like to have more perennials than we have. But we're concerned about adding another 10 million acres of corn. And so, we may have a land use, reflect those priorities in our sustainable availability assessment, and then reflect that in policy, which is that not all land uses are the same. And, this policy is going to intervene in land uses. So let's do that in a thoughtful way that reflects the policy priorities. So I hope that addressed your question at least a little bit.
So I think there's some, I appreciate the sort of background that you gave us, Jeremy, on how things have changed in the past few decades, because it has been some periods of rapid change. Andy, do you want to ask your question, kind of digging into those motivations for those changes?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy, for that nice synopsis of how things have changed and where we are now. So I was just kind of curious about the differences between the oil and ethanol subsidies, the historical differences and how we got there, and what am I need looking forward. Honestly, this policy space is a little outside of my realm, so I'm just like your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the corn side was very intentional, right? Like when the RFS was being developed, the ethanol industry knew what it wanted, the corn farmers knew what that meant for them, and they were clear, right? And if you look at the language in the RFS on biodiesel, it actually said like, yeah, we'd like to get to 1 billion gallons, and we don't know after. And the expectation was that, there was sort of this 5 billion gallon target for advanced biofuels, but at the time it was passed, the thinking was that would probably be sugarcane ethanol from Brazil or something. And so, and I think this is the part that really blows my mind in a way, is it's like, I don't think anybody back then would have said like, yeah, let's have 25 million metric tons of vegetable oil made into fuel. Like that's just insane and ridiculous. And what actually happened is that, the soybean oil folks, they kind of built a market. And then, frankly, because of this weird interaction of policies, the California folks said, well, we got this low carbon fuel standard, we're going to do it a different way. We want to see, we want, because of land use change, we're going to provide incentives for non-crop-based fuels. And so then, and then the oil industry said, oh, look, we can like move our RFS compliance into California. We can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. And then they started shifting towards those secondary fats and oils. And then, and then all sorts of other messy things happened where, like in the first Trump administration, they waived all the requirements with the small refinery waivers, and then the courts threw that out and it came back, and it was just a big mess. And then what you ended up with was, essentially the oil refineries trying to eat the biofuels industry, the biodiesel industry's lunch. And then in this administration, they said, well, yeah, can you guys just get along? And they said, okay, we'll just make a mandate big enough for all of us. And, so it's like keep the biodiesel industry and the renewable diesel industry, even though they're basically using the same feedstocks. And so paying no attention to feedstocks or how it affects US agriculture, we're sort of now proposing standards which impose billions of dollars of costs on drivers and taxpayers just so we can, suck vegetable oil and animal fat out of the whole globe in a way that, clearly isn't in any way aligned with, what US farmers actually have to sell. So I think the bio-based diesel story is just kind of a result of, policies that haven't been fixed and policymakers who aren't, making decisions based on data. And so, that's why I kind of want to get it back on track. Now, what does it mean for the future? I know you folks are working on oil-based fuels. I mean, so I don't want to say vegetable oil-based fuels are bad. I want to say vegetable oil-based fuels should be based on the availability of vegetable oil. And so if you guys can come up with novel crops that dramatically increase the amount of vegetable oil, that we can use for fuel, then that would definitely be something we should factor into the consideration of, what's domestic availability look like. And if you could do that in a way that improves soil health and water quality and all those things, that would be amazing. So, that's why I don't want to just say, vegetable oil-based fuels are bad. I want to say we need a quantity of vegetable oil-based fuels which sort of makes sense, reflecting that this comes out of our agricultural system and it's got to serve multiple purposes.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. We're now at the quarter of the hour, so I don't want to abuse people's time. Jeremy, I don't know if you have time to stick around for a little longer, but I understand if other people need to jump off at this point. I had another question for you. Can you comment on the role of AI as an energy consumer in this whole picture? When you showed sort of the liquid biofuel situation and contrasted it with electricity production for fuels, it seems like at least in the Midwest, what we hear a lot now is solar farms going on ag land, which was just banned this week by the USDA. And we have AI companies buying up power contracts for data farms here. So just comment on the energy consumption of AI, if you would.
Well, it's definitely outside of my area. I have some colleagues who are working on that, so I can see if they've published anything. But I guess so the only thing I'll say is that, certainly in the kind of electrofuel space, or, as we're thinking about what does it take to decarbonize the economy, if you bring in massive new loads that require electricity, and, if you want to do that in a way which doesn't increase climate pollution, you're going to need to find more renewable energy. So of course it does, raise the total quantity of electricity that we need. And I think especially when you look at electrofuels, people are excited about that. People who are really worried about biofuels want to do electrofuels because you could just make fuel out of electricity and not worry about biofuels. But of course, we need a lot of electricity for lots of things. But I don't know that I have much.
I think we're increasingly seeing it affect ag land. So that's
okay.
a new
Impact on ag
wrinkle
land.
that
Yeah.
we're seeing. It's a bit of a moratorium on it, but it is an interesting wrinkle that gets a lot of attention. Sort of like wind did when it started.
Yeah, it's definitely out of my expertise.
I see a question from Rustam about decarbonizing agriculture that I'd like to address just real quick. So basically, for example, does agriculture power itself with biofuels? And for the most part, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from agriculture outside of nitrous oxide emissions are pretty minimal compared to other sectors like transportation or energy generation. So Rustam, there's not been any kind of major push to use only biofuels, for example, in our agricultural sectors. And that is also part of the relationship with the energy density of the fuels that we use in large agricultural equipment. Any other comments that you'd like to make, Jeremy, before we thank you and let you go?
No, I appreciate the opportunity, and just say for anybody in the audience, or even if anybody watches the YouTube video later and has questions, I'm not that hard to find, and I'm interested in this topic, so don't hesitate to reach out.
You just reminded me, I just posted the link to the recent blog. I think August 8th, you wrote this blog about the discrepancies that you highlighted with us today between imports and domestic production. So I highly recommend that you check out Jeremy's blogs. If you do want a sort of a primer on how we got here, Jeremy's blogs over the years have demystified this for me in many ways. So I highly recommend them as, sort of pithy, data-rich information sources.
I'm happy to
All
hear
right,
that
thank
you
you.
call them pithy. They're
I mean, they're not
our
short.
publications team calls them too long.
They're
But
not
anyway, I
short, but you
appreciate
can get a lot out of them in one
that.
place.
Okay, good. Thank you so
Uh,
much for the opportunity. I've enjoyed talking.
Thank you so much. And Michelle also just posted the link to where you can find the past webinars. Jeremy's will be up within the next couple weeks on YouTube. Thank you all very much. Next week, we'll have Evan Bernowski talking about water quality incentive programs for Miss Campus. Have a great rest of your week. Enjoy the Farm Progress Show.